"Here it is!" cried Mr. Kranky, rushing into the kitchen. "1 carton of flea powder for dogs and 1 tin of brown shoe polish." George poured the flea powder into the giant saucepan. Then he scooped the shoe polish out of its tin and added that as well. "Oh, stir it up, George!" shouted Mr. Kranky. "Give it another boil! Oh, we've got it this time! I bet we've got it!" After Marvellous Medicine number 3 had been boiled and stirred, George took a cupful out of it out into the yard to try it on another chicken. Mr. Kranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping with excitement. "Come and watch this one," he called out to Mrs. Kranky. "Come and watch us turning an ordinary chicken into a lovely great big one that lays eggs as large as footballs." "I do hope you do better than last time," said Mrs. Kranky, following them out. "Come on, chicken," George said, holding out a spoonful of medicine number 3. "Good chicken. Chick, 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 chick. Have some of this lovely medicine." A magnificent black cockerel with a scarlet comb came stepping over. The cockerel looked at the spoon and it went peck. "Cock-a-doodle-doo!" squawked the cockerel, shooting up into the air and coming down again. "Oh, watch him now, watch him!" cried Mr. Kranky. "Watch him grow. Any moment he's going to start getting bigger and bigger and bigger." Mr. Kranky, Mrs. Kranky, and little George stood in the yard, staring at the black cockerel. The cockerel stood quite still. It looked as though it had a headache. "What's happening to its neck?" Mrs. Kranky said. "It's getting longer," George said. "I'll say it's getting longer," Mrs. Kranky said. Mr. Kranky, for once, said nothing. "Last time it was the legs," Mrs. Kranky said. "Now it's the neck. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat a chicken's neck." It was an extraordinary sight. The cockerel's body hadn't grown at all, but the neck was now about 6 feet long. "All right, George," Mr. Kranky said. "What else have you forgotten?" "I don't know," George said. "Oh, yes you do," Mr. Kranky said. "Come along, boy, think. There's probably just one vital thing missing, and you've got to remember it." I put in some engine oil from the garage," George said. "Did you have that on the list?" "Eureka!" cried Mr. Kranky. "That's the answer. How much did you put in?" "Half a pint," George said. Mr. Kranky ran to the garage and found another half pint of oil. "And some antifreeze!" George called after him. "I sloshed in a bit of antifreeze." Back in the kitchen once again, George, with Mr. Kranky watching him anxiously, tipped half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant saucepan. "Boil it up again!" cried Mr. Kranky. "Boil it and stir it!" George boiled it and stirred it. "You'll never get it right," said Mrs. Kranky. "Don't forget, you don't just have to have the same things, but you've got to have exactly the same amounts of things. And how can you possibly do that?" "Oh, you keep out of this," cried Mr. Kranky. "We're doing fine. And we've got it this time. You see if we haven't." This was George's Marvellous Medicine number 4. And when it had boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful of it out into the yard. Mr. Kranky ran after him. Mrs. Kranky followed a bit more slowly. "You're going to have some mighty strange chickens round here if you go on like this," she said. "Dish it out, George," cried Mr. Kranky. "Give a spoonful to that one over there." And he pointed to a brown hen. George knelt down and held out the spoon with the new medicine in it. "Chick, chick, 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 chick," he said. "Try some of this." The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon. And then it went, peck. "Oof," it said. Then a funny whistling noise came out of its beak. "Watch it grow," shouted Mr. Kranky. "Don't be so sure," cried Mrs. Kranky. "Why is it whistling like that?" "Oh, keep quiet, woman," cried Mr. Kranky. "Give it a chance." They stood there, staring at the brown hen. "It's getting smaller," George said. "Oh, look at it, Dad. It's shrinking." And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much that it was no bigger than a new hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. "Oh, there's still something you've left out," Mr. Kranky said. "I can't think what it would be," George said. "Give it up," Mrs. Kranky said. "Pack it in. You'll never get it right." Mr. Kranky looked really forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away, and at that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the 3 people below her, and she shouted, "What's going on round here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs, no bacon, no buttered toast." "I'm sorry, Mother," Mrs. Kranky said, "but we've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away." "No, let George do it, the lazy little brute," Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered in it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid, and it looked very much like tea. "Ha ha! Ah!" she cried. "Ah! So that's your game, is it? You just look after yourself all right, don't you? You make sure you've got a nice cup of tea, but you don't think to bring one to your poor old grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig." Oh, no, Grandma," George said. "This isn't—" "Don't lie to me, boy," the enormous old hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No," cried Mrs. Kranky. "No, Mother, don't, no, it's not for you." "Ah, now you're against me too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter, trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out." Mr. Kranky looked up at the horrid old woman, and he smiled sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma," he said. "You take it and drink it whilst it's nice and hot." "Oh, don't think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge, bony hand for the cup. "Hand it over, George." No, Grandma," George cried out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't! You're not to have it!" "Give it to me, boy!" yelled Grandma. "Don't!" cried Mrs. Kranky. "That's George's Marvellous—" "Everything's George's round here," shouted Grandma. "George is this, George is that. Well, I'm fed up of it," shouted Grandma. And she snatched the cup out of George's little hand and carried it high up, out of reach. "Drink it up, Grandma," Mr. Kranky said, grinning hugely. "Lovely tea." "No!" the other 2 cried. No! But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. Oh, Mother!" wailed Mrs. Kranky. "You've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine No. 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to that little old brown hen." But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. "Oh, this is going to be interesting," Mr. Kranky said, still grinning. "Now you've gone and done it," Mrs. Kranky said, glaring at her husband. "You've cooked the old girl's goose." "I didn't do anything," Mr. Kranky said. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous hissing sound was coming out above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. "Oh, she'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam," Mr. Kranky said. "She's going to blow up," Mrs. Kranky wailed. "Her boiler's going to burst." "Oh, stand clear," Mr. Kranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt the ears. "Call the fire brigade!" cried Mrs. Kranky. "Call the police! Man the hose pipes!" "Too late," said Mr. Kranky, looking rather pleased. "Grandma!" shrieked Mrs. Kranky. "Mother! Run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water!" But even as she spoke, The whistling suddenly stopped, and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. "Watch this, George!" Mr. Kranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of 1! Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Kranky. "That's just right!" But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down and down she went. In another half-minute she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Kranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression that it had always had, but her eyes were no bigger now than little keyholes. They were blazing with anger.
"How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're as miserable minuscule?"
"Ah, she's still going!" shouted Mr. Kranky gleefully. "She's still getting smaller!" And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a thumb, Mrs. Kranky made a grab for it. She held her in her hands and she cried, How do I stop her from getting smaller still?" "You can't," Mr. Kranky said. "She's at 50 times the right amount." "Oh, I must stop her," Mrs. Kranky wailed. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Well, catch hold of each end and pull," Mr. Kranky said. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then... Where is she?" cried Mrs. Kranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" said Mr. Kranky. "She's gone. She's disappeared completely," cried Mrs. Kranky. "Well, that's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," cried Mr. Kranky. "Oh, great medicine of yours, George." George didn't really know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Kranky kept wandering round with a rather puzzled look on her face, saying, "Oh, Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly. And by lunchtime she was saying, "Oh, well, I suppose it was for the best, really. I mean, she was a bit of a nuisance round the house, wasn't she?" "Yes," Mr. Kranky said, "she most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments, he had touched with the very tips of his fingertips the edge of a magic world.